Welcome to Lifestyles of the Not Jet Set, a travel and tourism show that's conducting an experiment to see how much fun a person can have without spending any jet fuel. I find myself as we cycle along the old Erie Canal to my left, reflecting on the question, how radical is too radical? Several days ago, we passed the first rapids on the Mohawk River, Coho Falls, where by tradition the Onondaga and Mohawk leader, Hiawatha, received the spiritual message of peace that led him to propose uniting the Six Nations to become one of the most important political powers among Native Americans and American Indians in the years leading up to the American Revolution. And I ask you, is peace too radical? Just yesterday morning, we passed through Oneida, New York, where the Oneida community, the followers of John Humphrey Noyes, practiced a radical experiment in communal living, sexual liberation, and I ask you, is a different approach to the economy too radical? And is sexual liberation too radical? Today for lunch, we'll meet old friends at a restaurant in Auburn, New York, where Harriet Tubman lived. Now, we all would like to tell ourselves that if we had lived at such times, surely we too would have been abolitionists. But it's hard to remember how radical they were considered. Many people thought that those who had held other humans in bondage ought to be compensated for their loss of property. But Harriet Tubman and the people who managed the Underground Railroad put their own lives at risk and just liberated people themselves. This evening, we'll camp not far from Seneca Falls, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton organized the conference that set the country on the road to the women's right to vote several decades later. At that convention, they declared, all men and women are created equal. And I ask you, is equality for people of all genders and sexual preferences and gender identities too radical? 2 days further, we'll reach Rochester, New York, where Frederick Douglass founded the newspaper, the North Star, after separating himself from the mentorship of William Lloyd Garrison and the Boston abolitionists. They agreed on so many things, but they ended up differing on the question of how radical should be the response to slavery. They all held pacifist principles, but Frederick Douglass found himself intrigued by the ideas of John Brown, who felt that such a violent institution as slavery surely was not going to meet its end without violence. In the days leading up to the raid to Harper's Ferry, John Brown invited Frederick Douglass and a young African-American follower of his from Rochester to southern Pennsylvania for 2 days of conversation. John Brown tried to persuade Frederick Douglass to join the raid. Frederick Douglass tried to persuade John Brown that surely this idea was folly. And Frederick Douglass wondered for the rest of his life whether he had made the right decision as he returned to Rochester. His young friend joined John Brown and met his violent death in the raid at Harper's Ferry. For each of these questions, there is a connection to the challenges of our own time. I'm partly cycling along for entertainment and fun and recreation and a break from work, but I do find myself thinking about the question, how radical is too radical, as we respond to the political power of the fossil fuels industry and think about how we can behave with a sense of justice in our own times.